It's a great honor to be able to introduce Terrell James. For over 3 decades, she has created paintings and drawings that are both rigorous and beautiful. And she has shown commitment, conviction, and clarity, my favorite C's, in developing her artistic language and vocabulary. She pushes the possibilities of abstraction to provide a platform, a meaningful platform in which we can explore ideas, experiences, and perspectives about art and life itself. Terrell is a 4th generation Houstonian, 7th generation Texan, and over the years, she has lived and worked in studios internationally, from New York to Bologna to San Miguel, Mexico to Berlin. Her works have been seen in galleries and museums throughout the US, Europe, and Asia, with 40 solo exhibitions, and is in the collection of many prominent international private and public collections, including the Dallas Museum of Art, MFA Houston, and the San Antonio Museum of Art. And in 2016, she was awarded the Texas Artist of the Year by the Art League of Houston. Terrell taught at Glassell School, Museum of Fine Arts in Houston for 14 years and was the chair of the painting department and has served as a guest professor at Rice University. And thankfully, and joining us today is Terrell's amazing studio assistant, Wolf McLean. He's a multimedia artist in his own right, photographer, filmmaker, theater director, and playwright. He has worked with Terrell for 10 years and has been a large part of her practice as a studio assistant, registrar, and documentarian, and as a curatorial eye and observer of the parallels and relationships in Terrell's work over the decades of its creation. Terrell, did you want to say anything before we jump into the questions?
Well, I do want to say something. First of all, it's been fun to get to know Johanna and to work with you on this, and especially nice to kind of reacquaint with Suzanne for various reasons. We go back many different cities and projects and have always really admired her eye. I just want to thank the museum too for this show. I think it's really perfect timing. There seems to be a real awakening of all sorts of interest in artwork by women, and I think part of it has really come through that book, 9th Street Women, and all the exhibits that are going on all over the world right now. So I want to also thank the museum, besides the curators, Lana and Suzanne, my friend. I just want to say that I have a lot of history and gratitude toward the Brown Foundation. And it's allowed me a lot of different opportunities. One, when I was just in my 20s, we had the Texas project of the Archives of American Art, thanks to the daughter, Nancy Brown Negley, who was in San Antonio and vice chair of the archives. Anyway, I had this great opportunity to learn a lot, and that was directly through the help of the Brown family. And I even remember, not only is Suzanne the Brown curator, but the foundation provided the funds for my piece to go into this collection, the first piece we're going to talk about today. I also want to tell you, I got to go to the very first opening exhibit of the museum, the San Antonio Museum, thanks to Nancy Negley, and the collection, a lot of which was at that time on loan from the Brown family. So that was in the 80s, very beginning. So it's really great to be able to be completing this circle with you all today. And I want to thank everybody who's here. I have a couple of friends who are here all the way from London who are probably very sleepy right now, 1 in the morning. So let's look at the first painting, shall we, Suzanne?
Yeah, we're gonna just organize the talk and kind of like start with what now, the present now, and what's in the exhibition, and we'll talk about what is happening right now with the works that are the paintings and field studies in the show. And then we'll go backwards. History not only in your work, but the history of landscape painting, and then we'll go forward. And so the first question I have for you is, your work is a very process-driven, intuitive, and organic. So I think a good place to start is your process in creating the two works that are in the show right now, the two paintings.
Well, I think that's a great place to start. Let's look at the game, Wolf, if we could. That's a picture of the back of my studio. There's a nice library and drawing table set up. So this is called the game. It's unusual for me because it's only acrylic paint. I almost always use oil or a combination of acrylic with oil. But this one just came along of its own without wanting more layers. It started out being really almost too lively and complex, but it needed some editing and simplifying. So I sort of brought things back in, quieted it down to the point where it was really too tame, and then had to bring life back into it. But I think in this piece, you can kind of see some of the spontaneity of my brushwork. That deep green at the bottom is a palette knife work. When I look at it, I see a shift going on between two planes, picture planes. One of them, it seems like we're looking at objects that are up and down, like rocks and maybe fissures of stone and water running through. But then it also shifts in my own eye to being sort of like a bird's eye view where we're flying over something. Maybe we see stepping stones or alternative walking paths, patches of earth. So I guess that's one of the things I would say, Suzanne, about my process is I often have more than one point of view in the work, and that kind of connects with some of the shifts in the structure in Cezanne's work. And you and I have been talking about his work the last couple of weeks a little bit. I think you can see that shift leading to cubism. Now, I don't know if you all can.
No, we're going to talk about Suzanne later. Yeah. But one question I had for you, and especially as you're exploring the relationship of light and color, there seems to be an ongoing conversation with your work. I mean, I don't know, it doesn't seem like as intense as maybe Michael Goldberg. He was Michael Goldberg was a second generation artist that subject of a number of poems by Frank O'Hara. And he had an intense relationship with Joan Mitchell for 3 years. Of course, I would imagine any relationship with Joan Mitchell would be intense. But he always said that sometimes he feels like he's battling his work. He feels like he's boxing with it, and he's in a battle with his work. I don't know if you find it sometimes frustrating in your work and you have to step away, or...
Well, there certainly can be a kind of knockdown, drag out with some pieces. Some of my favorite pieces almost seem to paint themselves. It's almost like I'm the vehicle, and those come quickly and you almost tend to mistrust them because they seem too easy, but they're actually the little gifts that you get from all the struggle and work and figuring out from other ones. So you might be kind of having a tough time and then suddenly you get one of those rewards. Maybe if we shift Wolf to the next, well, these were some of the Cezanne pictures I was thinking about, talking about the, yeah, okay, so that's a beautiful painting that I studied and saw so many times when I was quite young, in my 20s at the McNay. I thought that would be fun to look at since we're in San Antonio there. And then talking about the rocks and the walls and things moving, let's look at the quarry paintings at Vivimou. Yeah, there. So you can kind of see that structure, right, in the painting we were just looking at. Is there one more, Suzanne? Yeah, there, that's also looking at Mont Saint-Victor from the quarry past. So let's now go look at Eyeing the Door. This is the other big painting in Suzanne's show. A painting that was kind of a surprise to me because it has one of the things we were talking about, Suzanne, sort of the play between light and dark and how things can shift. This is a painting, I know that Suzanne, when you first were looking at it, you said, well, this is a rather dark painting for you. Well, you know, it is, but if you can imagine this, you see the lightest sort of butter yellow in a few patches of this painting. That was the entire, everything you see that's almost blue-black now used to be that color. So that's an interesting surprise for me. That dark passage came after the surprise to me of those kind of celadon and pink and blue brick forms. Now that, I mean, it almost came to me in a dream at night. You know, it was nothing, it doesn't look like anything I've ever put in a painting before that I can remember anyway.
So how does it come? I mean, is it like there's a memory or a dream or something as you're doing it?
There's a need for an answer to something that maybe needs a contrast, you know, like it had this beautiful butter yellow background. Suddenly I put that in, and I know it came from having been looking at a lot of Paul Klee work. You know, you can see those sort of shapes in him. I don't know how it comes, you know, that's the thing. It's like, I guess we begin as painters learning the material, and then slowly, if you're lucky, you have something to say, and you end up kind of building on your own experience and language. So you start finding your own voice the way a poet might. So I think part of it for me, it's, I never really know when I start a painting what it's going to resolve into or what it's going to look like. Unlike many artists, they have an objective thing you're looking at. So where do you think it would come from? I mean, where did things come from? Where is the imagination? You know?
It's wonderful. It's a great joy in life to be able to have faith in that and be able to let that happen and trust where you're going to go on that journey. Quick question, because somebody asked it and I was going to ask anyway, although we're holding off questions, but where do your titles come from and when do you title them?
Ah, that's something I was going to talk about a little later when you get that Joan Mitchell quote, but I'll just jump on in. I think for me, it's a lot of how I finish a painting, because I don't know what it's telling me. And then usually it gets almost finished and then I start thinking this might be close. And then I start trying to discern what it is that it's telling me. What is it that I know that's coming through that? So there are things that I paint that I don't know until I paint them. A lot of times the way I name or title something has a lot to do with what I'm thinking about or reading or researching. I really love reading poetry, and a lot of times when I'm reading poetry, I'll take a phrase or a word that encapsulates a whole concept or metaphor or something that crystallizes an idea that's in that poem. I have a whole list of words and phrases that are potential titles too, that I look at when I'm trying to name something.
Well, I'll go ahead and give the quote. We were going to do it later, but we'll do it now because I think it's so relevant. Joan Mitchell said once, "My paintings are titled after they are finished. I paint from remembered landscapes, which involve my feelings, which of course become transformed. Remembered landscapes that I carry with me. I could certainly never mirror nature. I would more like to paint what leaves with me." So I think that's so relevant.
So good, yeah.
But when I saw this work, and you call it I in the door.
Eyeing.
It's kind of hard. My first thought, and you're a Texan and I'm a Texan, and we never go into a bar or a honky tonk without knowing where the door is.
That's exactly right. So funny.
It's so dark. I'm thinking, yeah, you go into a smelly, dark honky tonk when that fight breaks out, you know.
You want to know how to escape.
Yeah, exactly.
I think in this case too, there's something kind of dramatic about the dark that came in over that butter yellow. And if you're in person with the painting, you can actually see that within fissures and cracks and little windows back into the back of the painting. And so it gives a reflective light. I think sometimes when we paint, there can be a color under that you don't even consciously see, but it reflects back through the color on top. And I think that's one of the keys to this painting, is looking back into it. This was in a show I had in China. It was in Shanghai. It was a lovely exhibition I did with two friends, Wei Hong and Lu Huang. Do you have that picture, Wolf, handy of that? Anyway, the brochure, I thought it was kind of great because they named it Eyeing Door, which I thought sounded sort of good, and the Chinese idea of eyeing door.
Yeah.
I guess we'll just move on from that. Wolf, are you able to hear me?
Field studies, because they're so crucial. It's such a critical part of your practice and process. So correct me, they began in 1997, and now there's over 750 of them.
That's right. That's right.
Do we have the field studies?
Yeah, I had no idea that this was going to be an ongoing series. I just had this experience where I was working on these paintings that were so hard to see, and they were trying to be like old master glazes and amber, and looking through, and they were very hard to see. I'd work on them for a year and a half, 2 years, layer, and I was at my studio and I went on a meeting somewhere and came back and I thought, gosh, what's this telling me? I like this funny throwaway palette just as much as I like this painting I can barely see into anymore for I'm working on years. So that started this series of being a little more open and playful about what the color could do. And I think that was a very big breakthrough. So I started with just these 6 pieces that were on the floor in my studio, and then I ended up showing them and going on. And I guess what we might want to talk about here is that it refers it's kind of a pun for me, because the field studies really are about the idea of the plein air painters in the Barbizon era, looking outside, working with color notes, like Corot and Rousseau, and we have some images here to show of those too, to get the idea. But basically, this leads to Impressionism in a way. I know at one point, people in Paris were looking at John Constable's paintings, and I know I read in someone's journal, I think it was Monet's, when Constable had a show in Paris, Monet said, there isn't mixed green on the palette. There's a tiny mark of blue next to a yellow. And when I see it, my eye does the blending. So there's that kind of rich moment there. But the pun for me is that it's also about my own process of painting, because they sort of chart and refer to my color palette as it progresses through a lot of canvas work. And so you could actually chart the timing of these year after year, starting in 97, still going on in 2020, numbered in sequence. And it's kind of been a fascinating process to learn from. Anyway, this series of the field studies, I'm lucky enough to have had Allison Green, curator of 20th century and contemporary art special projects at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, wrote a lovely essay about this series. There's a little book that we made even.
It was really helpful, you know, for her essay, and she wrote this very insightful and thoughtful essay. And she said that initially they were painting palettes of ephemeral notations rather than a finished composition, and they became more like a significant body of intimate paintings. In a way, I guess they, well, let's see.
You know, I just reread that essay, and I had forgotten one of the things I said in there, which I liked, which was that before, these were different because they were painted flat, and almost always I was painting vertically. And I had this idea, even though I was an abstract artist, that there was this metaphor of the painting as a window that you're looking through to something else. And suddenly the flatness made it a little more of an object in a different way, if you can imagine. So that was an insight too that came from these. The other thing I was going to say about the field studies, Allison named her essay something from Bachelard called, it's called Intimate Immensity, because they're small. And the thing that's interesting to me about that, which I believe comes through a lot of my work, is a sort of contradiction. So you can see this big painting kind of behind me that's on the wall. I love it when a large mural scale painting can invite you in, almost into an intimate space where you feel like you can fall into the painting. And I love the contradiction of a tiny, intense painting like a Forrest Best painting being able to hold an entire huge wall. Well, anyway, so that contradiction in scale is something that's interesting to me. Do you see that in a lot of work, Suzanne, that you are interested in, that scale shift?
Which is in the work itself you're talking about. And also it, in a very beautiful way, they're both, I mean, field studies to me are very expansive and exploring, and they have a kind of a energy where they seem to be ongoing and being expansive and more than
exploratory, and they lead me into other color combinations that, I don't know, open up. And they are often started from looking outside at a real space, but then it's so much too about my own environment, like the objects around me in the studio, the various fossils I collect or meteorites, different things. One of the things Suzanne also asked me about the field studies is about the surface, and it's on a slick vellum surface. So this might interest some of you who are painters. There's an appeal sometimes to being able to lift off as well as layer on absorbent materials. And sometimes I like working on things that can, like monoprints, where you can put the color down, but before it goes through the press, you can lift off on the plate and you can get a different kind of transparency and translucence and seeing through, kind of the way you can when you're working with oil on canvas. You know what you're doing, but it's a little bit, it's appealing, this surface change with the vellum.
And there's also the vellum, it's gives you an opportunity in much of your work to be more, to improvise and be more experimental.
Exactly.
And
let's light through, because you can push it and bring it back out and bury things and then scrape them away. A little bit like the way I work on canvas too, really. You know, just a very important part of these is the negative space, what shows through from the white behind it. A lot of these, you know, the first, I don't know, 100 of them or something, I didn't sign them on the front, but like, look at the upper left corner right there. You can see my initials and the year and the number of the field study. And so it just got to be impossible for me to know which one was which. So if something were framed and it was signed on the back, I was in trouble. So I started actually writing the information on the front. And this, you see, I can't quite read it, the number that is, but it's from 2012. I think that's a beautiful reminder of, for instance, the Suzanne image we saw of the quarry. Some of these, I think as our eyes form as children, we're constantly recording things we see. And it's really, as an artist, you're always looking and receiving. As a visual artist, probably as a composer, your sounds are coming into you all the time, in different space and silence between some of the sounds. So I think in this case, you know, we're just seeing things I'm bringing forward. It has to do with being outdoors and in nature, but it also has to do with being a painter and wanting to see what one color will do next to another. That one has a lot more movement, kind of crashing.
So they were, I mean, compared to what the landscape painters did, like in the 19th century, and they called them field studies.
Yeah, so there were studies done outdoors to bring back into the studio, and they were color notes taken directly. And I guess some of the people in the Barbizon school wrote about how valuable that was for them, because the light was different when they were outdoors, and the color, they could bring back the exact right color into the studio, which had different light effects, and really bring it closer to what they were seeing. So that was important.
And it's also your experience of those, of the light and what you felt.
Mm-hmm.
How did they change over time? Was there some key changes in how you used the field studies or thought about the field?
Well, I think really the change is just becoming more advanced in the exploration of the color and the brush stroke. And they do sort of change in terms of color. You can see, I think it'd be an interesting project for someone to compare, you know, to track as the color moves through the first half of, say, 2012, the second half, 2013, you know, you can track what's going on in my canvas painting. It's kind of a parallel, and you can see exploration in these that gets resolved in the paintings, because they really do come through the start of mixing color palettes for the paintings. And then I move those colors around and shift them. It's, they're very spontaneous. Sometimes they have more drawing in them, different years.
And so how does it compare? I mean, you're doing it outside, and where are some of the areas that you have gone to study and observe nature?
Well, actually, really, one of I have two large paintings that we'll probably eventually be able to see, I hope. But one is called Sotol View, which is actually a specific place in the Big Bend State Park, National Park. And it's sort of up on a rise, and you can see into the Santa Elena Canyon beautifully from there. And I was there with friends and sketchbook and looking and absorbing and drawing for about a week, hiking around. And I knew that I would be full of this landscape and light when I got back to my studio. So before I left, I had stretched and stapled to the wall a big, I was like a 22-foot long roll of canvas already primed. And so when I got back, I was able to start immediately on using that imagery and knowledge I got from working there and hiking there and thinking. And so I think sometimes it's really helpful to work in the space and bring that knowledge back.
Oh, there's one thing that made me think about it too, is that you're always working on field studies, but also when you're working in the studio on paintings, I forgot to ask you, are you doing multiple paintings at the same time? As I see that you're dealing with color and form and transition and light in the field studies. I mean, when you're working on paintings, does that help you by
Well, it's so interesting because I guess my approach is so intuitive. I'll think about certain colors and suddenly find myself, mixing a color for one painting and then have it in my brush and then suddenly turn around and say, wait, no, it needs to go to this other painting. It's very strange. But I think basically what happens is there's a lot being resolved in my eyes and in my mind, but I do still surprise myself. And I think working as an oil painter mostly, and in humid Houston, obviously we need to work on more than one thing at a time. I had some friends, my dear friend, the late Richard Stout, he was very specific about working with acrylic, and he would only work on one painting until he finished it. It was very deliberate. He probably had it a lot more mapped out in his mind than mine are, but because it was acrylic, he could easily do that. The other thing is there are people who, well, there's so many effects you can get. I love different things you can get with both acrylic and oil, but basically there's a thing de Kooning said, flesh is the reason oil paint was invented. It's much more of a skin,
Well, also it's slow and it is a different effect, but I always like how different brush strokes or different lines can affect. Again, it's, as you're saying, it's improvisational, but it can have a different effect. It can be fast, it can be slow, it can hit like different notes. It's almost like you're doing a composition, a very improvisational jazz composition or something. It's like hitting this and you're hitting that, and it changes.
One thing leads to another, but people are always asking me, I think Julian wrote this a minute ago as a question, how do you know when something is finished? Well, it's this sense because it is tricky, but I think we have this idea from working over the decades. You develop, if you're lucky, your own language, and it hits you when it's right and when it's not. And as I mentioned with the game, there was a lot of editing needed there.
Which is extremely important, I think.
It is. And it's also a way, when you learn how to cover things, it's a way that you can become more fearless in the painting. I had this great student one time, Ela Park. She was in her 80s, and she said, I'm not afraid of making a mistake in a painting. Maybe I'm afraid of making a mistake in a car, but in a painting, you can change it to get it back. These last few, maybe 8 pieces that Wolf is showing are on this strange stone paper that I like a lot, that is a little bit the same lovely, smooth texture that the field studies are on. These are much larger though, and can lift off and put on and stain. So you can sort of see the translucence, say like what's the light coming in and around that gray-green, olive-green part. There's a kind of gesture. And then I like the drawing, the way the line takes in this one too. Can we look at some paintings?
Can we have the other works that we're going to talk about? The older artists there, the landscape.
The art history.
Yeah, we're going to do a little art history. But I love the fact that you're willing, like on that weird drawing you're saying there, and I always like art that makes me like, what was she thinking? Or what is that? It's like you're willing to like just put that out there. you know, and it's,
Oh, not only willing, want to.
yeah, exactly. I
It's
love
like, hey, look at this. What do you think of this? It's part of the communication.
your work that you're taking risk. And I think we all need to take risk in life. And it's just like gutsy. I'm going to put it out there, you know, because you said, I want to, I need to.
Well, it takes a certain kind of confidence or even bravery sometimes to put your work out into the world. I mean, you're facing the possibility of ridicule and rejection and all sorts of things, but I don't know. You have to have a strong enough ego to take it, to take the negative reactions too, right?
Right. You're putting your, what you believe in, what you.
Or how about you as a curator? You have to face the critics too.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
We all have our critics.
Yes. And everyone, well, nowadays, everyone is a curator, and sometimes there are artists too, and a critic. And they can do it. Before we
Now I want to talk about these, which is the you know, the beauty of the quick brush work. These are early studies. That's a fantastic Corot. Look at the flow of the water. I picked this one too because it does relate so beautifully to those quarry paintings later of Cezanne. But you can see that this is very loose brush stroke, very loose freedom. Now this Barbizon bunch, they're coming kind of out of the Romantic tradition that is hierarchical. Look how, this is a color study, a sketch Corot did that, look at the bottom of this. This is very small. This is one of the things he would have done outdoors. You can see the almost scrawly brushwork at the bottom. And that's really early for this. And you can see how I would get a lot of permission from this and ideas about the flow, the movement.
And it's great if you think about how revolutionary it was after the academic, at the school, the academy, that this brush stroke could really, it would be a way of really feeling that fleeting moment in life and that kind of energy of life.
And observing directly that moment,
right.
Those clouds, that moment, yeah, the movement, the light is so beautiful. And this is more of a finished Corot painting. You see the figure at the bottom, but this sort of lovely suggestion of that ledge where the rock is coming over the water, and the movement of the light back behind that is so beautiful. Again, look at the left bottom quarter of this painting. It's almost photographic. It's sort of, I don't mean in its crispness, I mean in its blur, in its movement. Beautiful light on the trees. But you can see that, oh, that next one, let's go one more again. Well, yeah, look how free this one is. Look at that sky.
And that's the, you know, you think about too, is when photography came in, which was this time when photography came in, and it was like a crisis, but painting can do something photography can't do.
That's why we're still painting, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's breathy and observed. It has a feeling of a sensibility and a sensation that's recorded at that time through a more subjective interpretation, maybe?
Right.
I don't know that. I know photography can be very subjective, of course.
Of course, and it doesn't necessarily be about truth. We know that it can be subjective.
Well, so yeah, it's just as full and of possibilities as any of our art forms, really. So another beautiful, suggestive, dark branch. And these, yeah, okay, go ahead. One more. Turner, of course, one of my other favorites. Just beautiful. That light and the color look at that painting and then look at this big one behind me. Can you see? It's kind of, yeah, it's good. You can move on. Another gorgeous group of rocks. And those are just a lot like rocks I have floating around on surfaces here that I'm looking at in my studio. All of this is information. Another Turner that's sort of suggestive of my big painting behind me.
So did you, so over the years you've traveled and really studied paintings in museums and have a strong background in art history, which is.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to see a lot of great museums, right? Great art. I think it's very important to see things in person. That's one reason it's frustrating now for museums and art lovers to be separated from the real work, you know, and it's just not the same looking at things online. But we do what we can.
Well, there's a question I want to ask as we get near the end of this, but I want to ask you just a couple, like, just not, it's more like as a teacher, you've been teaching for a very long time. What kind of students do you find? How the students have, you know, what are they like? Or how's that changed? What does it do for you as an artist? It seems like it would take a lot out of you to teach.
No, I love it. It's one reason I'm having fun doing this with everybody right now. It's part of my sense of mission, really. It's educating and sharing, and it really goes back to being a little kid and doing a drawing and saying, well, you know, wait, hey, Mom, look at this. Look what I just did. I mean, it's part of the effort at communicating out that I feel in the visual art, coming to an audience and a group of friends who want to share whatever it is I'm trying to say. And I would say also students, it's a privilege to teach because I'm able to share whatever it is that I've learned in this long distance walk through the work and where it is that I'm going. But also I think about it this way, really, there's no one else who's had the particular group of teachers and painters that I've had. I'm filtering all those people through me. Mm-hmm. And I'm distilling all the things, the energy they put into me, one being lovely Dorothy Hood. I'm so excited to be in a show with my old teacher, Dorothy, which is in this show we're having now that's been extended until sometime in the first week of September, I'm happy to say. I just learned, because that was going to be closed much sooner. So this is in San Antonio if anyone's in driving range for that. But
I have one question before we open up to other people, and I really appreciate everyone's patience. You were talking about right now during the pandemic, and I don't know what the future or how long this will go on, but it certainly will change our experience of art. And also our understanding and appreciation of art and what this may be for us in the future. Now, I mean, also.
Yeah, it's a really curious thing to figure out, really. What is it we're trying to do, and how do we overcome the separation that this pandemic thing has put in our way? Well, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read a short paragraph that I just happened to get from a friend of mine, Margot, in London yesterday. She wrote this in response to my invitation that I had sent her about this Zoom meeting. And she said, well, I'm not going to be able to meet you. It's a little late for me. But she wrote, most people, we met because I had some work in an exhibition and she was so taken with it, she asked to meet me. She's a painter too. And she wrote, most people occasionally make paintings that announce themselves like some uninvited guests who in the course of the party do not manage to make any friends and remain unknown till the end. The invisible barrier remains. I have no doubt you know what I mean. Your paintings, I feel, pulsate with emotion. And by this I mean that they possess some palpable inner dialogue that continues while you work. And this inner dialogue remains audible to the viewer. I do not mean to say that all your paintings are equally successful and that each one of them is entirely resolved, but they breathe and their voices sound pure and clear. So I think that what art wants to be like in this future is personal, is to be personal and sincere and inquiring in some way. And I really hope that my work can induce some sort of change in people and bring them to the present moment. You know, to question things. I think the paintings present questions, not answers. And I hope that they can be challenging and not predictable, and that we can all bring an open mind to looking at art together. And I do think that this removal we have forced upon us right now, maybe art can bring us together in a different way of conversing.
I think we need to end this here, and before we open up the questions, but I want to express my deep gratitude, Terrell, on behalf of the museum and our audience today, for sharing your journey as an artist and as a human being. As we know, there is no separation between you as an artist and a human being. And for your generosity and sincerity and passion and compassion.
Thank you.
And I think it's so great to have your work in our collection and have your work in Texas Women. That could be an opportunity for us to have that conversation. Do you want to put an image, Wolf, of her work up, and we can have everybody ask questions, or what?
Yeah, we have a bunch of images we didn't look at, so
Okay.
I can kind of
Why don't we start sort of slowly looking at those and taking questions and see what happens.
All right.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, I do have a couple of questions that came up through the chat. I think just to kick us off real quick is someone was curious about the medium that you were using in the I'm
the door.
Yes.
Well, it's oil paint, and then some of the medium is what I often use, which is simply walnut oil and a little bit of Gamsol, which is a healthful version of turpentine. It's sometimes there's several different materials I use, but I think the beginning of that painting was pretty much straight oil paint, and then I started adding different fat to it. For instance, in this painting on the screen right now, that line is drawn on top of oil paint on linen, and that line is from an oil stick, which is a beautiful thing to work with, where you can draw in and then also push it around and blur it back out, because it's basically oil paint in a drawing stick form. But I'm really interested in different things to work with, and I think because of my many years of painting, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of unusual materials. So if there's a more specific question about what I paint with, I'd be happy to talk about that.
Yeah, another question that came up was the color studies, and if those were all done in oil.
Almost all. Sometimes there's a little bit of, well, I have some that start with acrylic and have oil on top, but most of them are oil, and they're on paper, so they're a little bit tending to leach out, and sometimes there are little pools where the oil is saturating in the paper, but the paper, it's a vellum, so part of the back of the paper is paper and the front has a resist. And I had some of these earlier ones before I knew that I was going to do a series of this. It was just some old palettes that I kept from like 1980, and they're fine. They're framed and they're surviving. So there you have it.
And then someone was wondering how large are, I think, the Big Ben sketches?
The sketches are just in a sketchbook, but the painting is 22 feet long. And I don't think we ever saw that painting, Wolf. Do you have such a view to show? Mm-hmm.
And maybe this is a good question to ponder on. If your paintings were music, what would that be?
Ah, that is a good question to ponder on. Okay, there's Sotol View and Tidal Threshold on the right at Barry Whistler Gallery, which is the same exhibition where Suzanne, you first saw the game that is in the collection now. So, but there's Sotol View. So if you can imagine, that's about 7 feet tall and 22 feet long. And that has oil washes, turp washes, the line at the top, which is where the Santa Elena Canyon is probably turp with pigment from oil, but all very washy. There's some charcoal drawn lines that are then fixed and then painted. You see that, you can even see some of my fingerprints there. Yeah, that's nice. Very transparent. I wish I did. I wanted to find the sketchbooks, but I wasn't able to locate them. But there was one point where I was drawing in the canyon and very specific, kind of tight drawing I didn't like, drawing exactly the rocks. And I felt like I wasn't getting the grandeur or the space of the place until I closed my eyes and I started drawing with my eyes closed and using my hearing of the water going through the canyon. And, you know, having seen it first visually, but then when I started working with my eyes closed, I started really getting much more of a feeling of the place, oddly enough.
Want to look at the Bald Head Island notebooks?
Oh yeah, that'd be great right now. So I was in North Carolina. I had a residency on Bald Head Island, which is very much the southern part of North Carolina. It's where the Cape Fear River comes into the Atlantic Ocean. Frying Pan Shoals is right there. It was called Cape Fear because there were so many shipwrecks right there, and pirates would wait there for the ships to wreck. But this is a beautiful kind of rice paper sketchbook, and some of the work comes through from the page as you turn the page. In other words, you're seeing sometimes the drawing on the next back page. Can you see what I mean? Like there's a ghost drawing that's actually from the sheet, the back of each sheet. So I really love the way it moves from one sheet to another, back and forth. So you see several levels of line. So that pale line in there is actually looking on the back of that page to the next. So can you just maybe turn the pages? Yeah. So this is looking out of my window at the landscape there. These are these beautiful, they have, it's the no boundaries art, an international thing, and it has, you stay in one of 3 old lighthouse keepers' houses. Isn't that beautiful though, the way you see from one page to the next, and the way the paper is beginning to show some of the wrinkles from using water on thin paper. And I just love the way it suggests a kind of rhythm of rock and walking through a beach. All this from the lighthouse keeper's house is looking past long, generous dunes to the water.
A question from Lydia, just 2 questions. that they really love that de Kooning quote you mentioned about skin.
Mhm.
But oil paint was invented. So as an abstract artist, when you're working non-representationally, how do you see the role of this skin like substrate playing in your work?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I see it as part of the way light moves through the skins of the oil paint. You know, the weird thing about oil paint is it doesn't dry the way milk in a pool would dry or water. And actually by drying, it's oxidizing, it adds weight, it adds oxygen atoms to itself so that it gets, it doesn't dry by evaporating, it takes on more matter. So I think there's just a sort of beautiful quality of the light that happens in an oil painting that you don't get with acrylic, from my point of view anyway. I think acrylic, you know, dries as a plastic, and oil paint is organic. So it's a different experience. I love working with acrylic too, because you can layer things and embed things and use paper and it won't rot and all. There are all kinds of advantages to both. But yeah. Do you see the sense of skin in a painting with oil though? I mean, I do.
And before, I don't want you to forget the question about if your paintings were for music, what would it?
Oh yeah, I didn't really go into that. Well, one of my favorite composers my whole life, and my mother said it was the only thing I would be calmed by as a screaming baby, was Bach. She listened to Bach quite a bit, even before I was born, when I was within the chambers. So I love the structure there. Maybe it's a little bit like Suzanne, a kind of climbing fugue structure, but then I also love jazz and the way there is that improvisation and one thing can take off in another. So you have a definite melody, let's say, but each time the quintet plays it, they're going to take it to a different place, and they know each other, they know where they want to go, but then they let themselves have a freedom within that. And we have one friend of mine here who's Tom Bickley, who is a composer and musician who does a lot with experimental music. What would you say about this?
I think you've got it exactly in terms of a flow and discovery process. In fact, when we were here, whenever that was, Christmas time, visiting with you, we were talking about the process, and it was, I mean, so I'm a time worker, right? Musicians are time workers, but it's dawning on me that painters are too. But that's the way we generally receive the work. But your articulation of that makes so much sense, of layering, working with the material. That, but it also leads me to imagine, wow, well, what would this painting be as it develops on its own, as it continues going? But yeah, I think there's not a mapping of one kind of music to one kind of art necessarily. Even with Saul LeWitt and others that were so intimately connected with Glass, the downtown minimalists, there's just a lot of different connections that can work. It's very interesting.
And it's personal too. It's very, very much a taste and what are you drawn to, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it may be, and can be surprising. You know, your work feels similar to my, I'd say, sculpting of sound, using a lot of ambient sources that I use, environmental recordings. But I don't know that anyone else would necessarily look at your work and say, "Oh, that sounds like that." You know?
Well, we hope they will. Sounds like this to me, yeah. And that's another thing, Suzanne, we were talking a while back about how some people want to know what something means. You know, well, what does that painting mean? Or what are you saying? And it's like, you don't really ask that of music, do you?
No.
Well, maybe you do, Tom. Because you're trying to make it, but.
Well, we're talking about, Tom, we were talking about how people always say well, a number of people will say with contemporary art, I don't get it. But I'm like, well, you don't get a tree, but a tree, you get enjoy its beauty. You don't necessarily, we can't write. I mean, I can't write or, you know, music or sing or but I can enjoy it, I can experience it, and I can be moved by it. So that's what.
I have a question for my friend Julian. I mean, we haven't spent really any time together. We just know each other from work and
Yeah, hi, Terrell.
stuff. Hi. But, you know, your day job has to do with light and lighting. Right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how do you think about light in painting? Because you're painting too. I mean, how do you think about it?
Well, it's funny that I asked the music question, because I always think of art as in music or in cooking. And actually also I think about lighting as in cooking, because there's also a methodology to it. But you don't have to intellectualize it. You just do it because you have a hunger and you cook and then you eat. So lighting and it's the lighting and the painting I never really use I never connect together, but I always connect.
Tone, right? It's a mood or a tone you're creating, or a
Yeah.
feeling. It's a feeling.
Yeah, but
film.
obviously I'm dictated by a script and a scene that I have to orchestrate the light to, whereas in painting it's sort of I just start somewhere and it's more like music in that sense, and one thing leads to another.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas within lighting it's a very structural thing. But I don't know, I although they're very related, I never really connect the two. I guess because I'm not in charge of the mood that has to be set. It's set by the director or the script. So, but it's an interesting thing, I must admit. But I tend to, my question about the music is sometimes when I work, I like having music on, and sometimes I really hate it because it distracts me. But I do find, it's like you said about the tree, Suzanne, actually, it's that you shouldn't intellectualize art, you should just respond to it. And like music, you don't, because it's around you all the time, you never really think about it. You like it, you dance, you sing, you whistle. With painting, you shouldn't have to really think about it too much.
Well, so this is another thing that's interesting about comparing visual art to, say, performing arts. So two good friends of mine who are ballet dancers here. So Lauren and Joe, well, what would you say, like, you know, there's a certain amount of interpretation where you bring your own art to that, but it is prescribed. You're dealing with a choreographer, sometimes yourself as choreographer, but, you know, these steps. It's always interesting to me, you know, to compare. Tom was saying, you know, he's more time-based, right? Well, I remember being so shocked one time when there was this very wild, abstract piece that I saw at the Houston Ballet, and I said to Cameron, well, I don't see how they can dance to that. I mean, because there's no way to find yourself in the repeating crazy, it was just all recorded percussion, and it seemed really repetitive. And Cameron said something that I think turned out to be true when we asked a dancer, well, they're counting. They're just counting. It's not about hearing the music and knowing you move this step then and this step then. It's all very, I mean, almost mathematical, right? But where do you pull in your own creative individual dance style within that structure?
Hi, Terrell.
Hey.
So, Lauren,
Hi.
great. They're in San Francisco, by the way.
I think that like you kind of mentioned earlier, like this is like besides what you're talking about right now, but like the filtering of like your teachers before you, and I think that's like a massive, like especially when it comes to classical ballet specifically, because it's like a form that's been done so many times over and over again, like a piece of scene that like your lineage is from the people that you have learned from, and that's like becomes your style. And that also happens when it's more like of a contemporary ballet as well, where you
Don't you rebel a little bit? Don't you rebel against your teachers too and do it your way?
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. I mean, but then you have to have that skeletal structure of the knowledge from the teacher in which to rebel against, I guess.
exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of like the structure gives you a certain amount of space to be yourself in. So it's kind of similar to lighting. I think that we have a framework that's prescribed, and then within that we have to find ways to rebel and be ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I heard a great quote, and an artist named Mikkel Rofner, she said, you have to take it all in, and there's a point where you just throw it up. So I think I have to wrap this up. I hate to. I think we could do this probably for another hour. And again, thank you, Terrell, for your generosity.
So many friends here. It's so great to be with you all in one way or another.
It's like family. We're having a reunion of a family we want to be with.
Right.
Well, thank you again. Well,
Sorry.
thank you again, everyone, and be safe. And we'll see you again.
Hey.
Yes, thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Enjoyed it.
Talk to you
Bye.
later.
Hi, Jenny.
Hey, TJ.
Hey,
There you go.
bunch of college friends.
There you go.
bunch
Hey,
of-
Walter.
Carol, Hannah, stay on. I want to watch everybody as they leave because then I know exactly who was here.
Carol, we loved it and loved seeing
Yeah.
you, Suzanne.
Oh, thank you.
Cindy Earhart.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Terrell. Thanks.
Thank you. Everybody call me.
Yes.
Well,
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.